This is episode 13 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Glyn Jones, the head of Gardens for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
She's not a witch. It's interesting that the two most effective practitioners in Shakespeare, neither of them practice traditional medicine. The ones that actually do something are these miraculous cures, but they're not real physicians.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
There are many doctors and physicians in Shakespeare's plays, like King Lear or Cymbeline. But how accurate is Shakespeare in his representation of medicine in early modern England? Today, Barbara Traister is visiting with us to share from her nearly 2 decades of research and study into one of England's most notorious physicians, Simon Forman, to talk about the accuracies of Shakespeare's representation of what medicine was actually like. Simon Forman was one of the practicing physicians actually alive during Shakespeare's lifetime, but contemporaries of Shakespeare, like Ben Jonson, would characterize this doctor as either a fool or in league with the devil. Given Shakespeare's own propensity for dealing out magic in context of healing, we're stepping behind the curtain today to explore the world of astrology and its overlap into healing and medicine inside Shakespeare's England. Barbara Traister teaches and writes about the literature of 16th and 17th century Britain, particularly about Shakespeare and his contemporaries. She has a PhD from Yale University and has held fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation, as well as the Folger Shakespeare Library, among several others. She's been a scholar in residence at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia and at the Medical College of Pennsylvania, where she also taught courses in medical literature. Her publications include Heavenly Necromancers, The Magician in English Renaissance Drama, The Notorious Astrological Physician of London, Anonymity in Early Modern England, and numerous articles on early modern drama, medicine, and magic. She joins us today to look at some of Shakespeare's examples of medicine depicted in his plays and explore where Shakespeare got it right and some of the hidden messages we can discover in the text by understanding the realities of astrology and 17th century medicine. Hello, Barbara. So glad you could be here today.
Hi, Cassidy. It's nice to meet you.
So did the concept of a physician exist in Shakespeare's lifetime?
Yes, but I would qualify that. There were practitioners of all sorts and have been, I guess, since the classical period. But in Shakespeare's lifetime, they were solidifying the idea of a professional corps of physicians. And they had the Royal College of Physicians of London, who were all university-educated men who had been examined in their knowledge of medicine. And they became a screening board for any other practitioner who wanted to work in London. In other words, they had to give you their okay before you could legitimately practice in London. So not everyone who had their okay was a member of this college, but they were doing things like making a dress code for themselves, and they had all sorts of regular meetings and began to do some anatomy work. And so they were becoming a professional class.
So it wasn't just a, free-for-all. I think we think of old medicine, and most listeners will think of the barber surgeon and the idea that there's this guy who plays multiple roles, one of which is medicine, kind of almost like a hobby. And what you're saying
is your hair, yes, and your beard.
Exactly.
Yes, the physician was a completely different group of men than the barber surgeons. Technically, the two were not supposed to overlap In other words, barber surgeons weren't supposed to prescribe medicine, and they weren't supposed to deal with internal ailments. At the same time, the physicians were not supposed to cut off people's legs or do the kinds of things that barber surgeons did. Barber surgeons developed really on the battlefield. They were very much a hands-on. They were regarded as a sort of workman. They didn't have the prestige of the physician class, which was the class that would come and see you if you had a stomach ache or you had some other kind of internal ailment.
There were other distinctions as well besides the barber surgeon and the physician. Can you make a distinction for me between the empiric versus a wise woman versus a doctor?
I'll try, although they all overlap to a degree. The wise woman was usually more often in the country, a woman in the village who used herbs and simples and this sort of thing to treat people. She would be the only person that was available, chances are, and people valued her greatly until something went wrong. And then sometimes she got in very bad trouble because then people would say she wasn't a wise woman, she was a witch. But really a lot of simple medicine was practiced by such women. The empirics was a term used for practitioners who did not have the degree, the medical degree, did not have the okay of the Royal College of Physicians in London. They only had that jurisdiction in London. And who simply by trial and error, by perhaps watching someone else practice, learned a lot about medicine. And they practiced unlicensed and could be, in some cases, prosecuted for their practice. The physicians were the authorized doctors and were used primarily, that was who the people who had money, who were in the upper echelons of the court, usually called when they got sick, was the physicians themselves.
Now, you touched on this just a second ago, but in this time period, there was this, especially under James I, and we see this reflected in Shakespeare's plays like Macbeth, there was a strong suspicion of people like witches. And you had the Salem witch trials and things like this, which came out of it. And the idea of conjuring was held in high suspicion, or potions were held in high suspicion. And yet a lot of these doctors were using herbal remedies and indeed, coming up with concoctions and potions to treat ailments that altered things like the humor of the patient. And to me, in reading it, there is a lot of overlap between what a physician did and what a witch would be suspected of doing. And I wonder if you can help sort out in Shakespeare's time, why was there an acceptance of people like physicians and empirics, even a reliance on them or respect for them, when there was at the same time a strong suspicion and disregard to the point of death for witches?
Well, that is an interesting question, and it brings up a fourth category, which we haven't even mentioned. And those were the people who were allowed, and their trade was to mix medicines, which were ordered by the physicians. Technically, physicians did not prepare their own medicines.
Like an apothecary or a pharmacy?
Exactly, a guild of apothecaries. And they were the ones who were supposed to prepare the medicines. And that was their job. Empirics often used apothecaries, although technically apothecaries were not supposed to deal with empirics, but of course they did. Empirics also sometimes mixed their own medicines. And I wouldn't be surprised if physicians occasionally did, although I think probably that was less common because they regarded themselves as sort of above that kind of labor. But yes, that's what I was talking about in the villages. When a wise woman gave somebody something and that person then got sick, often people would turn against her and declare that she was a witch. I think there were women in the period who believed themselves to be witches, who wanted to have power, even though it was power for the bad rather than for the good. But in fact, the kind of potion you see in Macbeth was not prepared. I mean, Macbeth is a wonderful mixture of physicians. There are 2 doctors in Macbeth, neither of whom do anything. They don't do any healing at all.
They're not helpful.
I can't heal. I can't deal with the mind. The English physician simply comes in and announces that the king is healing. He is using his touch. And that's why he can't come to a meeting. And it's a walk-on physician who just comes in to say, oh, the king is, and the English king is there to provide a contrast to the Scottish king. Scottish king is killing his people. The English king is healing his people. And neither the English doctor nor the Scottish doctor in the play do anything except, in a sense, authenticate the situation to say what's going on in England, what's going on in Scotland.
Speaking of representations of medicine and potions in Shakespeare's plays, in All's Well That Ends Well, Shakespeare gives a magical potion for healing to Helena, and attaching that to the concept of a wise woman and the overlap with witches, do you think that Helena, being a woman who remarkably heals the king in that play, is Shakespeare commenting on the overlap between doctors and witches? Or, I mean, I'm assuming female physicians was not a thing.
It was not a thing. There is no way. And Shakespeare discusses this more fully in All's Well That Ends Well than any other play. He talks about the king having consulted both the Galenists and the Paracelsians. Galenists were those who used herbs and simples as medicines. And the new medicine that was coming in was Paracelsian, which advocated using chemicals, having some chemicals, metals and salts and so forth in your medicines. And there was a big debate in the period. Some people simply combine both, which is what the empiric that I work with, Simon Foreman, did. But anyway, the play talks about the king says, no, Helena, you can't do anything for me because I've already consulted the Galenists and the Paracelsians and they can't do anything. And she says, I think I can help you. And finally, he's persuaded. So Shakespeare deliberately shows, I believe, that the 2 major branches of medicine that were being practiced in the period are ineffective here. And Helena does this magical thing. She's not a witch. This is not her potion. It's her father's potion. I don't think she's ever really been argued successfully that she is a witch. She is somebody who has inherited this, and it cures the king. It's interesting that the 2 most effective practitioners in Shakespeare, Helena in this play and Cerimon in Pericles, one of the romances, neither of them practice traditional medicine. The ones that actually do something are these miraculous cures. Cerimon awakes Thasia from death, if you will. Helena heals the king. But they're not real physicians. They have this sort of magical moment when they're able to effect cures.
Well, in modern medicine, we take medicine at intervals, like every 4 hours for a headache, for example. But clocks and general timekeeping was a relatively new idea in Shakespeare's lifetime. So how did they know how often to take a particular medicine? What did they use when they were take 2 aspirins and call me in the morning? What did they do?
Well, basically, medicine was prescribed using astrology. All physicians, no matter what kind they were familiar with astrology and used it to a greater or lesser degree. But every physician would refer to astrology when telling his patients what to do with their medicine. When Jupiter is here, or, they were always referring to the heavens and to the astrological configurations in the heavens. And so that was the best thing. Other than that, they would say, in the morning at such and such an hour at prime or something like that. And they tended to refer to the kind of clocks that churches used in order to time their services and that kind of thing. But yeah, there were no real clocks. So astrology was very important. Some doctors used it to diagnose, but
astrology wasn't just for timekeeping during this period. There was a strong relationship between astrology and what we call the four humors. Did they call it the four humors then? And how did astrology play into an understanding of the human body for these physicians?
Well, this derives, of course, from the classical period, as does most legitimate medicine in the period. Most of it comes from Galen. The four humors, the idea that there are four basic fluids in the human body and that they are in balance: the blood, the yellow bile, the black bile, and the phlegm. And in every human body, you are healthy when those fluids are in a particular kind of balance. When you get too many of any fluid, you begin to get ill. In other words, but the one in your particular makeup that predominates, for example, if you are a melancholy person, that means you have more black bile than other people. It doesn't necessarily mean you're sick, but if you get too much of that black bile and it goes way out of balance, then you can go mad. Lots of things like that can happen to you. So the fluids in your body are impacted by where the heavens are, what's happening up there, where the planets and the astrological signs are at any given time. And that's why a lot of empirics, at least, I don't know about the physicians in the period, I don't think they did this, but the empirics often drew a horoscope, a birth horoscope, when you came in to see
what kind of humor you were going to have from birth.
Yeah, or sometimes they did a horoscope just for the day that you were there, to show they had to know your birth date in order to do it, to show what was predominating and influencing you on that particular day or that particular week.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there was an actual education process for formal physicians and doctors in London, not necessarily the wise women or the empirics, but there was kind of a formalized education process that was at least in its infancy. And I wonder, based on that, was the study of the four humors, or this is featured so much in Shakespeare's plays, I wondered if the average theater goer understood that, or was he shooting above their heads and aiming, at the nobility or the presentations he'd be giving at court?
No, I think everybody had a basic understanding, a rough understanding of the humors. They knew about, maybe not, they couldn't recite them off easily, but they could understand when somebody was sanguine or somebody was choleric or melancholy. But people didn't always understand them right. There's a very funny passage in Twelfth Night where Toby Belch and Andrew Aguecheek are drunk and are having their trying to dance. They say that we were born under a particular sign which influences our legs, and that's why we're such great dancers. And it turns out that they're wrong. Neither of them understands quite what and the irony is that the sign that they mention that they were born under is the sign that governs the throat and the neck. So it refers to their drinking,
them being drunk.
They don't understand that. They are wrong about the humors, but they can use it in their conversation. They have the jargon. They just don't know. They're just wrong about it. But I think the point is that lots of people knew about it, and most people would be more correct than they were. They were drunk. They weren't very bright anyway. And so the joke there for the audience of Shakespeare's time, which we just don't get, is that, that they don't know what they're talking about when they were such great dancers. Because
makes a comment about their state of mind and their, I want to say stupidity, but that sounds so mean.
Well, they're a little dull.
Well, I mean, there were various ways of controlling these humors, whether you understood your star sign correctly or not. But some of the methods included, bloodletting, or I read an article about medicinal leeches. And I wondered if you could talk about some of the common methods of treatment like these. First of all, for the modern reader, and certainly playgoer, our first question is, was that real? Did they really do that?
Oh, yes, they did. The leeches came a little later. There was a bit of use of leech at this period, but that wasn't the big. The point is, if you had too much blood, you had to let the blood out. And in the late 16th and early 17th century, most people actually did bloodletting on a regular basis, especially if you were a choleric person, which meant you had too much blood in a sense. They would bleed you regularly, maybe every 2 months or something like that. And it had been going on for ages. I don't know if you remember the old stories of Robin Hood, but Robin Hood dies from somebody bleeds him and they don't turn it off at the right time. And he is killed by simply bleeding to death because nobody controls what they should have done. But yes, people were bled regularly. The other thing, the less, I guess, invasive thing that was done most often was purging. And they purged both downward, and if that didn't work, they purged upward. That is, they made you vomit. And that was thought to get rid of excessive humors.
So it was cleansing. They were trying to they assumed it was in there and they're just trying to get it out.
Right. They're trying to get all the excess out. And if that didn't work, then the next step would be bleeding, usually. They didn't bleed children, and they rarely purged children because the methods were just too harsh. But everyone else got bled and purged. They didn't bleed women very often, women who were still menstruating, because they felt that women bled regularly anyway, and so they didn't need it as much.
They didn't,
And in some cases, they did not treat men who had hemorrhoids because they believed that the bleeding from the hemorrhoid actually had a good effect on the body.
That's amazing. I mean, that sounds, wow. Who would have thought that this would be the way you'd put that together?
When you really haven't looked inside the human body, because remember that there were pretty strong prohibitions. Again, they were just beginning to get some corpses for anatomy by this time. And so Galenic medicine is really based on anatomy of animals. And so a lot of stuff that goes on inside the body, nobody understood or knew.
It was a lot of guesswork.
A lot of guesswork. They used their best analysis. And it's when you think of the systems that they work, these very intricate humoral systems and so forth, you have to think, my goodness, they were very inventive and they took the evidence they had, women bleed, men have hemorrhoids, they put all these things together and made them fit into this pattern, but the pattern wasn't really right. I mean,
I did want to ask about one theme that happens in a couple of Shakespeare's plays, but made me question one of these guesswork or even a mistake by physicians. In Romeo and Juliet, faking death is a theme, as well as in Pericles, there's this tone of death sometimes being optional, in that Thasia revives after being presumed dead. And I wondered if that was an indication that in Shakespeare's lifetime, death, or the idea of knowing when someone was actually dead, was hard to do, or at least often miscalled. Is that accurate?
I understand once in a great while it's still miscalled in our own culture. You think, but yes, people would try to figure out if someone was breathing. They would, try to figure out if the person had lost all color. There were all kinds of ways that they diagnosed death, most often by holding a mirror or something like that, or a feather. Remember at the end of Lear, he thinks Cordelia is still alive, and he asks people around him if they have a feather so that he can hold it to her lips and see if she breathes. That was the most common way of diagnosing death. And we know, especially in plague time, for example, there are a few stories of people who were thrown into plague pits, and it turned out that they weren't dead. I suppose people didn't really want to get close to them, and so they didn't do as much investigation about whether they were dead or not. Yeah, Romeo and Juliet is a good example of somebody who, although from what we hear from the way she is described, this is a potion that comes so close to death that it's probably not real. That is, it's probably an exaggeration.
An example of creative license as opposed to...
Yeah, it just pushes it. I mean, they certainly have potions that could put you to sleep.
Well, some physicians are noted as being particularly notorious, as you call Simon Forman in your book. And I wonder if you could explain why you consider him notorious.
Well, he was called notorious by his contemporaries. That's actually a word that I put in the title of my book simply because he was considered by others notorious. This is for lots of reasons. One is he was an empiric, and he was operating broadly in London and Lambeth, where he lived, and he seemed to get away with it. He was thrown in jail a few times, but he was giving the official physicians a run for their money. And one of the interesting things that you notice when you look at the records of who got prosecuted and who didn't in London is that as soon as one of these empirics became quite successful, he suddenly, and was clearly making a lot of money and had patients that were drawn maybe even from the nobility. Suddenly, the College of Physicians would come down on them as empirics. And I think the competition they didn't like. And so Forman kept being thrown in jail, kept getting out, and continued to practice. They couldn't shut him down. And that made him notorious. The other thing is he wasn't a particularly wonderful human being. I mean, I don't think I would have liked him very much if I had lived in that time. He was a pretty good doctor. He treated his patients well. Unfortunately, it's pretty clear that he probably sometimes took sex in payment for some of his treatments of women. He wasn't a very pleasant man, I don't think. I think he was quite harsh and grumpy. He was one of the London practitioners who the College of Physicians tried and tried and tried to shut down. And finally, he moved to Lambeth, which is across the river, across the Thames, and technically out of the reach of the London College of Physicians. But they still kept after him, still tried to have him thrown in jail.
So excellent stories for research and a book, but we might not want to be his friend if we'd known him in person.
Exactly. It's fascinating. He's absolutely fascinating.
This entire topic and field of study is so rich. I know that it's something I would want to learn more about. What is your best recommendation for places to go when you want to study this topic or learn more about it?
I can recommend a couple of places. One is Gail Pastor's work, and you may know Gail. She used to be the person in charge of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington. She has a book on the humors, which is excellent. It's called Humoring the Body, Emotions and the Shakespearean Stage. And these are books which she also has an earlier book on leaky women, which is wonderful. And these are books which take Shakespeare's plays and then read them in terms of the medical context of the period. And if you're interested in Shakespeare and medicine, Gail's books are really fantastic. If you're interested to see some of the weird cures and the way patients were treated and how many patients a physician might see in a day and all of this sort of thing, there is a new resource that wasn't available to me when I did my book. I had to go over to Oxford and spend a lot of time, reading manuscripts and trying to decipher Forman's hand and all that kind of thing. But a woman named Lauren Castle, who has also written on Forman and medicine in the period, has a project at Cambridge, and I can give you a website in which all Foreman's papers and the person that he mentored, Richard Napier, their case books are now online. And you can call them up on your computer, and they also have transcriptions so that you don't have to read secretary hand. And you can see some of the actual cases, the people's names, all kinds of wonderful, wonderful discoveries. So if anybody feels like playing around in the archives, I can give you the website.
Absolutely. We'll get that and put that in today's show notes. These resources do always come out after you've completed your book, right?
Yes.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm retired, so I'm not actively working and publishing as much as I did at one time. My current interest is actually not specifically in magic. It's in Holinshed's Chronicles, which Shakespeare used to write his history plays and so forth. And I'm very interested in the way Shakespeare and Holinshed treat Ireland in the period. And so I'm trying to work on a series of essays about that. So I haven't done anything with the medicine for a couple of years, having spent 30 years working on that.
You feel that it's okay to move on to a new project now.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for taking time out of your day to talk with us. I know I have learned a lot and can't wait to dive into some of these resources that you've mentioned. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To get up close and personal with some of the history you learned about in today's episode, you can travel with That Shakespeare Girl in September 2019. I have partnered with British History Tours to offer the ultimate Shakespeare experience. It's 8 days in London and Stratford, seeing where William Shakespeare worked, lived, and how he built his enduring legacy. We'll see places like the Globe Theatre, and you'll learn all about staging and performance and his life living in London and Stratford. To get all the details and to sign up to be notified when tickets go on general release later this year, visit cassidycash.com/travel Shakespeare.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at cassidycash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.